previously looked at the rise of cities in terms of increased immigration in the United States in the second half of the 1800s and early 1900s, and also the byproduct of the rise of political machines. We now move to some of the more negative aspects of city life, but also we look at some of the attempts to maybe improve it. Now, given the amount of wood used to construct cities in the aftermath of the Civil War, fire is an ever-present danger that nearly all of them dealt with. You include all of this excess wood and the fact that you have candles and kerosene that are the most common forms of lighting, that can be a recipe for disaster. Now, the summer and fall of 1871 was exceptionally dry, and warm winds began to blow from the southwest in early October. So our focus is the city of Chicago on the southern shores of Lake Michigan. The night of October 7th and into October 8th, a massive fire began in the barn of the O'Leary family, which is an Irish family on Chicago's west side. Now, the common story has always been that a cow kicked over a lantern, and Mrs. O'Leary denied it, and it was never conclusively proven. All that was proven was that the barn was the source. The winds carried the flame to the south side, which is where the fire was most intense at its outset. Accounts exist of sidewalks that are completely littered with furniture and possessions that families wanted to save. Horses were either roaming on the streets or they were panicked and running away. And people fled in sheer terror. The Chicago River did not prevent the fire from spreading throughout the city, and really taking refuge in Lake Michigan was the only option. At about 5 o'clock the next day, citizens began to emerge, and a heavy rain began to fall the next morning at 3 a.m., so the worst was over. Now, overall, all or part of almost 17,500 buildings were destroyed. Over 300 people died, 100,000 lost their homes, and property damage exceeded 200 million. It became known as the Great Chicago Fire, or the Great Fire of 1871. Now, it really depends on who you ask. It caused Chicago and other major cities to reconsider not only the materials they used to construct their cities, but how they built their cities. Now, unbeknownst to many at the time, a fire that was responsible for much greater loss of life was simultaneously playing out in the Wisconsin North Woods. Very similar to Chicago, the summer and fall had been unseasonably dry. Yet small fires were set for the purpose of clearing the land for construction of railroads and also for farm settlements. A strong wind carried the flames and turned them into a firestorm. Now you can see on the map here, firestorm is what made Peshtigo so destructive. It was even so destructive that Allied forces in World War II studied how to recreate these firestorms for bombing campaigns against the enemy. Between 1,200 to 2,500 lost their lives, and over 250 were buried in a mass grave because there wasn't anyone left to identify them. Wisconsin's governor had already diverted the state's aid resources to Chicago, so there was little left for Peshtigo. Simultaneous fires, as you can see on the map, broke out in addition to Oconto County and what's now Marinette County. They broke out in Brown County, Kewaunee, and Door County. The community of Williamsonville that you see that lost 59, they were wiped off the map, and the survivors never rebuilt. So with more people, meaning more building in the cities and more wood, fire was the ever-present danger. Initially these early cities looked more like villages because they had an abundance of single-family homes, and the churches often served as the tallest buildings. As lots began to fill up and land prices increased, single-family homes were just too expensive. And the first, what we would call apartment in New York City, was built in 1869. It's only about 5 stories tall, and there were some supporters and detractors of the system. Many feared that they didn't know what would happen when unrelated people lived together under one roof. But economically, it made sense, because if more units existed on the same lot, prices would be lower. More were built within the coming years, and while some in the upper class continued to shun them, single men and married couples that were childless found them to be economically viable. As the 1800s wore on, tenements were constructed to help deal with the influx of immigrants and people looking to live in cities. They were usually narrow and deep and about 3 to 6 stories tall. Each living space was equipped with a parlor that had a window and a room that did not. Investigation after investigation revealed the appalling conditions in these tenements, such as jamming as many people as possible into the rooms, which led to clear overcrowding. Each tenement was supposed to have a fire escape. They were supposed to have 1 toilet per 20 residents and increased ventilation. And an 1879 law stated that every bedroom needed a window. It really wasn't until the late 1800s and early 1900s that true reform became attempted. Now, speaking of reform, you get an idea here of some of the filth that was present within the cities. Cholera in 1849 is going to force New York to attempt to clean up their streets. Thousands of pigs in cellars were slaughtered or relocated. Cows were banned from the streets. They were paved. Garbage collection began to improve. But city corruption had prevented New York from solving its sanitation issues. Enter George Waring, 1894, a Civil War veteran who was given control of the sanitation department. And he demanded total control of operations and hiring and firing, which he got. Now, the poor neighborhoods were the worst of it, because rich neighborhoods had paid for private cleanup for years. Residents resisted. All right, residents are going to resist because the site of local government had always meant corruption. But Waring won over the residents because nobody had ever really tried to clean up their streets before. So it became a model on which cities began to base their own sanitation departments. He wanted his sanitation workers to be highly visible. So they were Waring's white wings, dressing in these white outfits. So more crowds lead to more fire hazards, but we also see that they lead to new living conditions that aren't exactly great, but the cleanup efforts are going to make some progress. And finally, more crowds leads to crime. Now, a dramatically increasing population really exacerbated crime, with petty pickpockets and thieves serving as the main offenders. There's other crimes, but these are the most prominent. New York City authorized the nation's first salaried police force in 1844. And the methodologies to try and catch criminals really intensified during this time. Thomas F. Burns was an Irish-American detective bureau chief who popularized the use of what was called the third degree, an intense method of interrogation. Essentially, the third degree amounts to physical and psychological torture, and Burns was forced into resignation by new police commissioner Theodore Roosevelt due to allegations of corruption. His methods did receive partial credit for helping form the basis of more modern detective agencies, so there was some positive, so to speak, that people took from it. When it comes to dealing with crime, nobody stands out more than Jacob Riis. Now, Jacob Riis was born in Denmark. He came to the U.S. at age 21 to seek work as a carpenter. But he unfortunately ended up on the losing end of New York City crime. One night, he had to spend on the streets, in an alley on Mulberry Street. And he was allowed to come in from the rain to stay in a police station. But he discovered that a golden locket that he had brought from Denmark had been stolen. So he knew firsthand the problems with pickpockets and thieves. Eventually, Riis found employment as a journalist. And he was assigned to the police department, where he spent the rest of his life. He spent years covering all of the problems in his district, which was centered in the crime-ridden Mulberry Street, the same place where he spent that night. Fires, murders, and robberies were the predominant crimes that he covered. He also shone a light on the squalid working conditions of the people who lived in the tenements. And even though this had been done before, he emphasized the human element and constructed his articles more like stories. The thing Riis is most remembered for is that, he innovated flash photography, so he could go into rough neighborhoods at night to take his photos. These images and his descriptions were published in 1890 as the book How the Other Half Lives. And this is one of the more famous images. It's actually Mulberry Street, and it's called Bandit's Roost. The title helped emphasize class differences in New York, and the pictures themselves were iconic. Teddy Roosevelt read the book when he was serving as a civil service commissioner, and he was hopeful that it would galvanize well-to-do New Yorkers to take some action. When Roosevelt became police commissioner of New York City in 1895, he met with Reese and relied on him to use his role to make the city a better place to live and work for those whom conditions of life and labor were hardest. The two collaborated frequently, and really Reese was the first of what we would call muckrakers to work with Roosevelt to try and reform society, specifically conditions in these growing cities.